Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. I love this question. I was thinking as I was preparing to record this episode how wild it is that we've been having this conversation, if you've been with me for the entirety of this podcast, since the end of the year 2020. So it's been just over 5 years now, and I've never answered this question, but it's such a wonderful question. So the title, right, what kind of books do I recommend, is the shorter version of the longer question, which is, what kind of books do I recommend? What are my favorite books, and what am I currently reading and excited to read next? This is such a valuable question because I think there's so much to learn, and there's so much that humans have thought of in the entirety of writing and publishing and communicated language that exists past the current moment in which it's communicated, right? And what I mean by that is, for a long, long time, humans transmitted stories through oral tradition only. And at some point, there came the practice of transcribing the meaning of those words that they were saying down onto something, whether it's a wall or a stone, and eventually becoming paper, which is what we have now. And even more transcendent than paper is these digital electronic files that you can just pull up. I was in a coffee shop in Santa Cruz just a couple weeks ago, reading a Friedrich Nietzsche book. Like how amazing is it, the time that we live in? So without further ado, what books do I recommend? Well, that's an interesting question. And I think it depends on where you're at in your journey. I think that for some of you, you may just be discovering Christianity, and you may be wondering, what is this whole thing about? And so this is my honest, subjective opinion. I always caution against reading books from people that are alive. And this isn't to downplay anyone that's alive that's written a book. I've had people that have authored books on the podcast before as an interview, and I've bought and read books from people that are alive. What I caution about is attaching yourself to one particular viewpoint or pastor in the realm of modern Christianity. And so as much as I would love to say, go back and read Tertullian and the first century Christians and see what they have to say, that might be a little challenging, and it might be a little too narrowed in focus and specific to certain aspects of Christian doctrine, especially if you're on the side of just learning more about Christianity. And so my favorite go-to for anyone, well, actually I have two favorite go-tos. For anyone who's just entering into Christian thought and exploring the idea of Christianity, one is, if you're on the more skeptical side of things, The Reason for God by Pastor Timothy Keller, who was alive when I bought the book and read it and has now passed away, is probably one of my favorite books for rational arguments for the existence of God. And they're not super in-depth. They're pretty 30,000-foot view kind of arguments, but he's real and he's raw and he's honest in that book. And I love that about it. Now, if you're on the side of things to which you're exploring Christianity after having agreed upon the truths that are within it, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity is probably a really great place to start. Again, it's an overview. It's high level, but it's honest. It is philosophical. It's raw. And there are truths in Mere Christianity that I still talk about, and you've probably heard me mention them on this show, like the last chapter, or I think it's the second to last chapter. I can't remember. I don't have the book right in front of me, but C.S. Lewis talks about this thing called the dance of God to explain the Trinity and what it is and what it means. And I just think that that's a beautiful, comprehensive view of Christianity. Now, if you want something that's a little more in-depth as a introduction to what the Christian life should look like, probably one of my favorite books other than the Bible is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor who had nothing to gain from selling his books, which is another reason why I'm also skeptical of authors that are alive right now, is because, well, they have something to gain monetarily if they sell their books, right? But if someone's been dead for a while and their books are still popular and relevant, well, they're not going to make money off those books. But that tells me that something in the book carries weight and meaning that transcends its time period. And I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship is one of those books, and I say he had nothing to gain because he escaped Nazi Germany. But then God called him back into Nazi Germany to start an underground church in Berlin, and he eventually lost his life in a concentration camp because of it. But he wrote this exposition, which is like an explanation, a deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And he extracted from that principles for what it means to be a disciple and follower of Jesus. And again, it's real, it's raw, and it's honest. I would say my top 3 favorite fictional books. Whether you're a Christian or not, I think they explore themes of morality and meaning and life and good and evil and what it all means. I think my number 1 favorite book is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In this book, he follows the lives of 3 brothers whose father was a scoundrel. The eldest brother, burned by religion and fully sold out to the atheistic and communist ideas that were emerging in Russia at the time that Dostoevsky wrote this book in the 1800s, is the hardened atheist, the realist, the rationalist. The second brother is a worse scoundrel than even the father. And the third brother, the youngest, is a priest who is uncorrupted by the Orthodox Church in Russia in his hometown, which was becoming very corrupted at the time, and whose mentor was also one of the last few good priests in that town and was slandered after his death by the corruption of the church. And I don't want to spoil too much of it, but this story transcends so much more of its modern era and the questions it calls to mind. And I think another one like that is The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. The ideas in those books are, though presented in sometimes a childlike manner, as the themes deal with magic and hobbits and elves and dwarves and wizards and all of these fantastic things, but the ideas are so deep and rich and allegorical in a way that is not always obvious, that requires you to pause and think. And the way Tolkien writes these books is just amazing. And the third book I would add to this list is another Fyodor Dostoevsky book, Crime and Punishment. It is, in my mind, the quintessential villain arc that both shapes and rivals the idea of a villain arc and morality and good and evil that we have in the West today. The main theme that Raskolnikov, the main character, deals with throughout this book is the by whatever means necessary kind of thing, that as long as the outcome is good, maybe the means to get there are justifiable, even if the means mean murder and theft. And then you have kind of the opposing archetypes, his best friend, Razumitin, and his enemy, who is trying to marry his sister, Svidrigailov. And you follow them on this journey and this wrestling and this questioning that, well, I won't spoil the end of all their characters, but there's such a satisfying end to it that once you get there, the reasoning and the rationalizing in your head that you have to do is just, it's a reward of a maze that you walk through, and you get to see its completion. And like I said, the questions and the themes transcend 1800s Russia and are extremely relevant to our modern day and age. So those are books that I agree with, and I think I should not leave this one out. Probably the most honorable mention is a book that I reference again and again on this podcast, which is The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. This is probably my favorite C.S. Lewis book, and it's a metaphor for how you live life. And essentially, these ghosts that are in hell get this opportunity every day to take a bus from hell to heaven. And at any point, they can step off the bus and stay in heaven. And the book walks through why they don't stay in heaven, why they choose hell over heaven. And spoiler alert, the end reveals that it's all a metaphor for how we live life now. And it's beautifully, intricately woven the way he represents us as these ghosts and heaven as the really real place. And of course you have your classics, like books by Augustine, books by Tertullian, which I mentioned, books by Thomas Aquinas, some of the classics of Christian literature. If you want books that are more sermon-like in nature, Charles Spurgeon has literally a lot of his sermons published in books, among other writings and letters. And one of the greatest preachers of our modern day and age was the late Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, a medical doctor who left his field of practice to go become a preacher, has also written many, many books that are also great on Christian life and, again, a little more sermon-like in nature. And I say that because there are many modern authors, and I was just listening to a Joe Rogan podcast that had one of my favorite people on the planet on this podcast, and that's Bono, the lead singer of U2, and he talks about his experience encountering books and thoughts from a man named Richard Rohr, who actually lives in the same town that I do in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But Richard Rohr writes about a universal Jesus, and he does this in a kind of secretive way, maybe, like he kind of slips the point in underneath you, because he talks about how there's a mystical side to Christianity. And I see this influence kind of popping up, that there's like a Christian mysticism that borders on Gnosticism that is arising in the church. And there's a lot of pastors that are publishing podcasts and books that lean towards this Christian mystical idea, and it's very counter to what we know of Christianity. And don't mishear me, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a mystical, metaphysical, and phenomenological spiritual experience, because I think a lot of the authors that I referenced would also argue that that is to take place in Christianity. But what we should do is guard ourselves against heresy. And so that's the other strength of reading old and ancient Christian authors, especially the ones that have stood the test of time, is you can test modern authors and ideas against one of the four legs of logic in the Christian church, the first of which being scriptural authority. Is the idea and the doctrine being presented found in Scripture? The second of which being church authority. You see, we don't like that word here in America as much in the West, especially in evangelical communities, but the church historically has been the authority and should be the authority that keeps heresy at bay, meaning we are to lean as a community on each other, and especially on our leaders, those that are called to present the Word of God, to help us decide what is correct and what is heretical. And the third leg being history. Does the historical Christianity that's been passed down to us and vetted through those first two legs, and the fourth one, which I'll get to here in a second, does that line up with what's being presented? And the fourth one is simply logic. In a very Thomas Aquinas, Aristotelian kind of way, does what's being presented to us line up with logic, or does it contradict itself? Are we changing definitions to things that they were never formally agreed upon being? Or are we saying things break the law of the excluded middle, as I've just referenced the other two first principles from Aristotle's laws of logic, and we say, well, Jesus can mean something to you, and he can also mean something to someone different, and both practices are valid, as Richard Rohr would probably say in his theology. It breaks logic. It breaks the law of excluded middle because of the other three legs of the chair on which we must sit when we discover writings and works and decipher whether they are true or not. And so with that, I think those are some good Christian recommendations. What about the non-Christian side? I reference Friedrich Nietzsche a lot in this podcast. I love his writings. They're crazy sometimes. They're anti-Semitic sometimes. And so if you're going to read Friedrich Nietzsche's writings, take this as a grain of salt. They can be kind of offensive, but Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morality and Thus Spoke Zarathustra are really great writings to understand how Western ideas and philosophies were shaped. Like, is Raskolnikov correct? Would Napoleon go and murder the old pawnbroker and her sister just as he did in Crime and Punishment? Maybe. I don't know. Like, if Friedrich Nietzsche's analysis of morality is correct, then maybe whatever means possible is justified so long as the end is good. Another one that comes to mind comes from an experience that I got to have. At one point when I was a pastor on staff at a church here in Albuquerque, I had the privilege of setting up an event where we actually flew the great mathematician, Dr. John Lennox, down to the university here, the University of New Mexico, and orchestrated a conversation between him and a prominent atheist professor here. And prior to this event, I took Dr. John Lennox out to lunch, which is still a phrase I am amazed and humbled that I even get to say. And we were talking, and at one point I asked him, so what made you want to do this? What made you want to go around the world and defend, debate, and have conversations about Christianity and apologetics? And he looked at me and said, he'll never forget the moment. He said he was 13 or 14 years old, and his father handed him a copy of the Communist Manifesto. And his father was a very loving, gracious Protestant minister in Ireland at a time where Protestants and Catholics were at war with each other and literally fighting each other in the street, committing acts of violence against each other. And his father was loving to both Protestants and Catholics. But he handed his son, Dr. John Lennox, this copy of the Communist Manifesto and said, "Son, I think it's important you know how other people in the world think." And so Dr. Lennox read this book, and from then on, he felt like it was necessary to put these ideas to the test on the public stage. And so I will probably, when I have kids, hand them a copy of the Communist Manifesto when they're 13 or 14 years old to carry on this tradition of it's important you know how other people in the world think. It's important to challenge your beliefs. And you may disagree with me on this. You may have the gift of faith that I've referenced a few times on the show, and that's okay. I don't think that everyone has to go and read dark books. Like Goethe's Faust and the idea of Mephistopheles is such an amazing book. I love that book as well, but it's dark, and I don't know that everyone should read it. The Communist Manifesto is a dark book. I've read it twice now. Hitler's Mein Kampf is a dark book. I've read that one as well. And so if you're up to the challenge, go learn what other people think. Go learn what people think that you currently wildly disagree with. I've read socialist books. I've read many atheist books. One of my favorite things to do is read A Brave New World and then read The Abolition of Man right after it. There is an honesty in a tragedy. Macbeth, Hamlet, and even Romeo and Juliet are beautiful, but they're tragic. There's truth in them that can help you tilt shift the world into a proper perspective of both the joys and the sorrows that it contains. But not everyone can read stuff like that. And so maybe I'll close with this, and maybe today will just be a little bit shorter of an episode, but fair enough. The last one was an interview and fairly long, so let's have a short one today. God is the God of all truth, and I think when we read things, we have to ask, does this align with the truth? And we can't always answer that question, and so I think sometimes, depending on your personality and your psychological bent, it can be helpful to read things that are controversial. It can be helpful to read things that you disagree with, and I just had another thought. Even as I say the word controversial, I think one of the things that pops into my mind is news stories. And, you know, if that's all you're reading is a news story, man, you're missing out on thoughts and ideas. Like, just turn off. I don't care what news it is, Fox News, CNN News, whatever. Turn it off and go read a book that was written like 400 years ago. The world is so much more alive with ideas, with pictures, with characters and archetypes and principalities that wrestle beyond our current day and age. That maybe the most helpful thing I can recommend is just go to your bookstore, go to your library, and look at the classics section and read that book that you've always heard about, but that you've never actually opened the pages of. And I can't believe I've made it to the end of the episode without saying this, so maybe this is just really funny, but read the Bible. Probably should have started there, but oh well. I guess sometimes it depends on how you hear and interpret a question as to how you answer it, and so maybe I just didn't hear and interpret that the way I should have. But I'll close with this. So we'll redeem the time. If you haven't read the whole Bible, read the whole Bible. Maybe do it Genesis to Revelation. Maybe do it in some other order. Maybe audiobook it. I audiobooked the Bible, I think 2 years ago now, in 27 days. The entire Bible. I filled my entire day. I think I was listening to like 7 or 8 hours a day of the Bible to get it done in 27 days. And you know what? That was so refreshing. And the other part of the question is, what am I currently reading and what am I looking forward to reading? I am currently rereading The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis because it's been a long time since I've read those. I currently have cracked open, as I usually do, Aristotle's Metaphysics, and I am looking forward to reading, which I've never read before, The Divine Comedy by Dante, which includes the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And so, there you go. Happy summer. I hope I've given you enough ammunition to go create a summer reading list yourself. And I encourage you, just go read. Even if you're going to read a book that's written by an author who's still currently alive, reading a book is still better than watching a screen. There's still something more engaging with your mind when you are turning the pages of a book. And so there you go. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours. Like, comment, share, email in, do what you got to do. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.